Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sai here today to bring you our final part of our US civil rights topic for this term, which concerns us now with presidential action and the Black Power response that happened post 1965. Do check out the earlier videos on this series. We went into a lot of detail about the civil rights movement and especially their actions and all the progress they appeared to have made in the early 1960s. As always, do remember these are lessons catered towards the student level, so our content will provide us with some key knowledge and test our historical skills along the way. With all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So as I said, this video is going to concern ourselves with the Black Power movement that came about. Because as we said, we talked about the civil rights movement and the ideas of Martin Luther King and the peaceful protests and direct action. However, there was a growing section of African Americans who were not convinced that the peaceful methods of Martin Luther King were the correct ones to use. Again, we already had some friction between SNCC and the SCLC, but now we have more friction that's come about, and this idea of Black Power that is increasing in popularity. So what key question are we going to consider now after 1965? Well, we're going to understand what exactly Black Power is. What is this concept? And especially what groups begin to practice it and follow it and the leaders that promote it. Then we need to understand why the peaceful civil rights movement begins to decline after 1965. We'll discuss in a moment the progress up to this point and the extent to which people began to believe the civil rights movement was no longer needed. And finally, we have to understand why the federal government becomes less concerned about progressing civil rights after the amazing progress that Johnson managed to get through by 1965. So there are three key questions to bear in mind as we go through this, and we're going to take each one of them in turn as we progress throughout this lesson. So first off, let's just recap very quickly the situation by 1965. As we should understand, there was a lot of de jure progress. They had a lot of lawful change that had come about. We've seen two incredibly valuable civil rights acts come about. We had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which removed a whole swath of discriminations that had come about for African Americans and pretty much showed the federal government was going to get involved and make the Deep South finally fall in line and finally end those segregationist Jim Crow laws at last in education, in public workplaces, on buses, in employment. It was all over. So this was a massive milestone for the African American. This only doubled in progress in 1965 when Johnson, after the march at Selma, passed through the Voting Rights Act and spoke very passionately to Congress and the Houses about how they should finally honor civil rights and get this progress through. Remember, he also capitalized on Kennedy's assassination and how they should honor his memory and pass these bills as well, because he had fought so hard for them towards the end of his tenure in 1963. However, there were some clear limitations. While we now had this brilliant lawful progress, de facto real progress was still lacking. Again, it's still early days. These acts have only just been passed. As years go on, if any more progress began to be made. But it's important to remember this was not instantaneous. Again, there's been gradual progress for African Americans. And while they may get their freedom in law straight away, it's going to take a long time for these things to finally iron out and finally manifest in real life and real progress. We also have a big political change to understand that Johnson really alienated the Southern vote. Again, those Dixiecrats, they've been backing the Democrats for decades now, ever since the fractions came about in the 1940s. They've had these concerns about civil rights progress and have really been leaning socially conservative on the right, very much so. However, now Johnson has basically said outright, despite his heritage as a Texan, as a fellow Southerner, he was against that idea and really pushed civil rights progress to happen. So that's really changed the political landscape now for the American government and really showed a lot of people they can't just trust the Democrats blindly to be against civil rights. So we're going to see a real shift in the 1960s here. We already mentioned George Wallace, how he's mounting a challenge in the South, why Anglo-Saxon Protestants in the South really latch onto and want to follow. And there's two other things to consider as well. We're not going to talk in massive detail about this, but the Vietnam War has also occurred. This concerns more so with the Cold War in the wider world. But this is a war America has embroiled itself in of its own accord. Johnson gladly followed the Hawks in Congress and submitted themselves to this full campaign in Vietnam. However, by committing to this war, it's going to prove costly, not just on the American people's lives, but also economically as well. And so we're going to see Again, remember that Johnson spoke about the Great Society, how every American was going to improve and have a wonderful time and really fulfill the American dream. But it's very difficult to achieve that when they're spending millions of dollars every year, every month on this conflict halfway across the world. And so that's really going to drain resources and also take away focus from civil rights as they get more embroiled and find this greater battle as they perceive it in the Cold War. So that's our background. That's the situation around 1965 and into the late 1960s. In mind, let's go on to now actual Black Power and this response that came about to peaceful civil rights actions. So first off, we have to define what exactly Black Power really is. And the truth is, it's quite a muddled concept, a muddled movement that comes about. Unlike the civil rights movement, it actually has no clear leader. The civil rights movement has pretty much settled on Martin Luther King being the symbolic leader. And they have different groups, they have different leaders within those groups. Martin Luther King is the best speaker and being present in the media at many of the key campaigns, Birmingham, Montgomery, Selma, and even Albany. He, in a way, has become the symbolic leader. The Black Power movement doesn't necessarily have that. We're going to see in a moment that there are indeed some key leaders we can point to, and one of them, someone called Malcolm X, started the term use of Black Power. But for all intents and purposes, there were no singular leaders, certainly not post 1965, that one could point to. Now, generally, what do we mean when we say this word Black Power? Well, again, it's quite loosely defined, but its common themes that run throughout these groups we're going to see are this idea of separatism. Now, what we mean by Black separatism is that these groups are focused on improving welfare and achieving more political equality for the African Americans. However, they actually want to split off from white communities. Again, there's a big revival of this thing called the Go Back to Africa campaign, where they actually want to raise money to move all African Americans out of America and go to Africa. Quite an ambitious thing. It does not gain much ground in actually manifesting into reality, but it's an idea that comes about all the same. They also wanted to say greater economic and political rights. To do that, they actually want to break away from white communities. In some ways, they want to monopolize segregation again, but this time for African Americans, rather than the whites putting it onto them, they want to separate of their own accord, of their own decision, and split themselves off that way. However, there are clear radicals within this movement. We're going to see a lot of them come about and actually call for something called black supremacy and even white extermination. Many of them in the Black Power movement are actually going to advocate for self defense, for violent response to white racists. Again, this is a real big contrast to the peaceful civil rights movement. Whereas Martin Luther King was happily saying, turn the other cheek, take on these attacks, let the white racists attack, and show people in the world how vehemently racist they actually are. People in the Black Power movement wanted to fight back. They wanted to punch back. They wanted to hit. They wanted to start their own riots and actually cause some chaos. So it's a big difference in concept, a big difference in idea that's going to grow in popularity as this new movement gains more popularity. In short, Martin Luther King himself summarized it quite succinctly as a slogan without a program, where no member really knew what it was or even what it actually meant. It was just something that kind of got out of hand as time went on. And for Martin Luther King, actually distracted from the work of the civil rights movement and their efforts to try and make good progress. But who exactly are these Black Power activists that I keep talking about? Well, let's find out. So there are three key leaders in the Black Power movement. We're going to take each of them in turn, and they all actually represent a different group within the Black Power movement. First one we're going to look at is Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. Then we'll look at Stokely Carmichael and his offshoot from SNCC and CORE and how he radicalized those movements. And then finish with Huey Newton and the Black Panthers. And quickly clarify, it's not the Black Panthers from World War II, although that battalion is where they got their name from and what inspired them and the use of militaristic language. The first group we're going to look at now is Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. Now, first off, let's get a bit of background here on who exactly Malcolm X is before we go into the Nation of Islam. But if we're going to point to anyone who originated this term of Black Power, it would most likely be him, the one who popularized it in the media and made it quite famous in America. So Malcolm X, who exactly is he? Well, Malcolm was born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1925, and he grew up with a father who advocated for black separatism in the 1930s. Malcolm's father spoke passionately about how African Americans should break away from white communities and make their own way in the world. And Malcolm himself actually attributed the death of his own father two white supremacists are the ones who went after and killed him. Malcolm's now impoverished and widowed mother could no longer cope, and she actually was placed in a mental hospital in 1939. Malcolm X wanted to be more than that, though. He wanted to break away from the tragedy of his family and what had happened to them. He actually dreamed of being a lawyer, but he actually found that many whites were putting him down and saying it was not a realistic goal for him to try and achieve. He ended up moving to Boston and living in a ghetto there during the Second World War. He became disillusioned with working hard for a life, and he actually switched to getting involved in the gangs in the ghettos. He took part in drug dealing, pimping, and even burgling. And by 1946, he was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment for his criminal actions. While he was in prison, he then joined something called the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam was a black separatist religion that considered all white Americans evil. They were essentially black Muslims, but they were advocating for black separatism on a scale that had not really been seen before. They stood in stark contrast to the likes of Philip Randolph's Brothers of Sleeping Car Porters and the NAACP, who were fighting hard in the southern states to achieve integration with whites. By contrast, Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam were going to fight for the black separatist tradition, particularly focusing in northern cities and the ghettos and publishing and using their speeches there to advocate separation rather than unity. Malcolm X became quite influential once he was released from prison, and within the Nation of Islam, he actually successfully recruited thousands of African Americans to join the group. He campaigned in places like Detroit, Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. He even became the minister of Temple Number 7 in Harlem. Two things that stood out in all of his speeches were first the idea of self-defense, that he stood very starkly in contrast to Martin Luther King's actions of peaceful protest, and he called for violent response for African Americans to hit back, to riot if necessary, and even kill. In one of his speeches, he said he would happily kill to defend his women, kill to defend his friends, and kill if it meant freedom for the African American people. He even openly criticized non-violent movements. And as we get into the 1960s, he actually firmly stood against the March on Washington. He called it a farce and said it was something to be mocked and did not deserve the international attention that it was getting. He came into conflict, though, within the Nation of Islam. He was calling for militant revolutionary action, but even Elijah Muhammad, who was leading the Nation of Islam, did not like it when Malcolm X criticized and even mocked the death of President Kennedy in 1963. He was suspended, and by 1964 he officially left the Nation of Islam. Despite his outcast, he still continued to campaign, he still did many speeches, and many believed him as the harbinger of black power and saw him as a role model, an inspiration really for the ghetto residents and their poverty they faced. He even openly said that he was an extremist and he was glad for what he was doing for the movement, regardless of the leaders now disagreeing with him. By 1965, though, he was outright even rejecting the teachings of the Nation of Islam, and it led to his assassination during a speech by Nation of Islam gunmen later that year. The Nation of Islam itself also began to attract much criticism from blacks and whites alike. Their calls for a return to Africa were seen as very unrealistic, both for whites and, of course, African Americans. They also lost favor with the peaceful movements in the civil rights groups as well. Many of them hated how Malcolm X and Nation of Islam at large had criticized Martin Luther King. They even called him the slur and Uncle Tom, which was a slur for an African American who behaved in a subservient way to whites. And it was seen as a mocking, derogatory term to apply to King when he was fighting so hard to achieve civil rights progress for African Americans. So they lost a massive support from African Americans for that. They also lost the Black Power support as well by assassinating Malcolm X as they did. In many ways, they actually martyred Malcolm by doing so and only increased support for him in his death rather than support for their own movement. If anything, we should point to Malcolm X for the person who achieved many things for starting the Black Power movement. He famously emphasized why he spoke to people the way he did during a speech in Chicago, where he said that the African Americans are lost people. They don't know their names, their language, their homeland, God, or their own religion because it had been taken away from them by white communities. They'd lost their history through so many generations of enslavement. Malcolm worked hard in his mind to improve the lives of many African Americans. He used his sermons, he used his speeches and his writing to advertise and encourage critical thinking on the race problems within America. However, it also meant he encouraged racial hatred and violence. Big reason Black Power movement began to hit back because Malcolm X himself was saying so, even calling and demanding that they do that. He also drew attention to the dreadful ghetto conditions and the poverty that were facing many African Americans in the cities. He became a clear black icon and role model for many youths. He wanted to inspire people to know that their life could be more than the poverty that they were trapped in. And it was these actions that he called for that inspired other people like Stokely Carmichael and later the Black Panther movement to come about and lead a new generation of black activism that was going to manifest as Black Power. And so, what exactly is going to happen then with the Black Power movement? How is it going to evolve now Malcolm X is gone, but now he's inspired several people throughout America to follow in his footsteps? Well, that's what we're going to look at in our next video when we go into after 1965 and see the changes that he has called for. As always, thank you for watching. I hope you found this quite insightful, quite useful. Do make sure you're following along in the comments below, and do check out the further reading as well in the description box if you'd like to learn more. We're going to carry on, as I say, in our next video. We're going to look at SNCC and CORE and also the radicalization of those groups, and especially the Black Panthers and how they move forward and use Black Power for their own means. With all that said, this has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.